So we're beginning a new series this week at all of our campuses, and it's Jonah, the absurdity of it all. I love that title, especially when we consider what are some of the things that happen in this book. A lot of it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It is extremely absurd. I mean, think about it. A fish swallows a dude and spits him out. Can you think of anything more laughable? Can you think of anything more absurd than that? And in fact, most liberal theologians and scholars, they scoff at the very concept, the very idea. And while I believe it 100%, it's not the focus of the book. But be honest, immediately when you hear Jonah, you think of Jonah, the very first thing that comes to mind is a well. For me, the very first thought and the very first picture that comes to my mind is VeggieTales. And I can't shake it. No matter how hard I try, I just think of the VeggieTales version of Jonah. But to truly read through the book of Jonah, you'll see that it's far different than what VeggieTales portrays it as. Jonah is the son of a man named Absurdity. And Jonah's name literally means dove. And it fits with Israel because, well, they're depicted as a dove, and a dove typically means something peaceful. And his first prophetic message and proclamation fit with his name because he was bringing, or was to bring, a message of comfort, a message of hope, a message of peace to Israel. It was that the Lord has seen the affliction of his people, and that he would save them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, and that he would restore the borderlands that they had lost through the invasion of the Syrians. Jonah came from a town not too far from Nazareth, which is the home of his great antitype, Jesus. And as a prophet of God, Jonah served during the reign of evil Jeroboam II. And most likely, Jonah lived not too far after the ministry of Elisha. But the theme of the book emphasizes this absurd grace, this outlandish grace, this grace that just does not make sense. Jonah, this recipient of God's grace, was unwilling to share that same grace with what he considered to be his enemies, the Ninevites. They were absolutely wicked, absolutely, or better yet, absurdly wicked. And I think part of the reason why he didn't want to share that grace with them is because he knew that God would be merciful to them. So what does he do? He runs away. Let's read from Jonah chapter 1. It will not be on the screen, so you will have to grab a Bible. How absurd, right? Grab a Bible in church. Or grab your phone, use the app, or just listen. Jonah chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Now, for our purposes, that very passage, that very verse, the very first verse, could be read this way. Now, the word of the Lord came to, fill in your name, saying, go to Wilmington, go to Chester, go to New York, go to Elton, go to Bear, go to your family function, go to the very next bedroom, if you will, and cry out against it. But Jonah thought it was absurd, and he rose to flee to Hawaii from the presence of the Lord. And he went down to Baltimore and found a ship going to Hawaii or Cancun or Jamaica or the Caribbean, somewhere where there's no snow and it's warm. See, Jonah, he knew that God loved the world, but Jonah didn't share that part of God's love for others. Why? What's the purpose? What's the reason for your for Jonah's disobedience? He wasn't a coward. I mean, if you read the story, he gets on the ship full of strangers, and these storms, they blew up, and he's not afraid. I mean, we can tell that he has a backbone. He's not afraid at all. To go to Tarshish is much more dangerous than going to Nineveh. For him to get to Nineveh would mean that he would have to travel on land. To go to Tarshish is something completely different. Going to Tarshish is much farther, and it's off the coast of modern-day Spain. And it's a much longer, more dangerous journey. Now, part of his unwillingness, though, was that he was a patriot. The predominant idea of his country was that they were greater than everyone else. That there's no way in the world that God could love them also. That there's no way in the world that God would extend his grace to those people. In his mind, all other nations were outside of the reach of God's mercy. But even more than that, even more than him being proud of his nationality, these were the Assyrians. These people were the sworn enemy of Israel. And they were, according to Hosea, they were the curse with which God was going to punish Israel for their idolatry. God was going to use them to punish his people because they were disobedient. And for generations, the Assyrians had been attacking Israel. Well, not necessarily Israel, but the lands bordering Israel. And the punishments that these Assyrians would use were extremely absurd. They were extremely cruel. Their tactics were far beyond anything of that time. They were known to skin their victims alive and then impale their bodies on sharpened stakes and then leave them there to die. History also tells us that they often forced parents to watch their children being burned alive just before the parents were killed themselves. They were also known to bury their victims alive up to their necks and then leave them there to die of hunger or thirst or until a wild animal attacked them. We know from history also that whole cities had been known to commit suicide rather than to fall into the hands of the Ninevites. And now, the Ninevites had focused their attention on Israel. And it was common knowledge that the Assyrians were coming and that they intended to destroy God's people. And so when Jonah hears the call to go and evangelize the city of Nineveh, he makes this decision to go in the opposite direction. He goes to the western coast of Spain, about 2,000 miles in the opposite direction. It was as far as he could go to get away from God. Can anything be more absurd than that? This prophet is thinking that he can escape God. Nineveh is northeast, but he takes off due west. And the announcement of God's judgment to Nineveh, Jonah, he saw the possibility of God presenting them with grace. He saw the possibility of God loving someone other than his people. He saw the possibility of God sparing his enemy. Jonah knew God's character. He knew that God was gracious. He knew that God was merciful. He knew that God was kind. And he knew that God would show that grace and that mercy and that kindness and that love to the people that he hated. I mean, think about this. Jonah is God's prophet. His entire being, his entire character, all that he is wrapped up in the salvation of his own people. And there's no doubt that his deep patriotism made him question the wisdom of God's command and made him ready to abandon his prophetic office rather than risk the welfare of his own people. I mean, as a prophet, Jonah had to read the Psalms. He had to be familiar, at the least, with the Psalms. And as we read this morning, even if he took the wings of the morning and dwelt in the uttermost parts of the sea, he could not flee from God's presence. But like many of us, he thought that by a change of environment, he might get away from the pressures of God's call. He thought that by changing jobs, maybe this call from God won't be as heavy. If I just go to another school, maybe things will work out differently. If I move to another state, maybe things will be different. And so he goes down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. But he had been called to go to Nineveh. Where is the Lord calling you to? What has he commanded of you? And where are you headed? Why? What is it that he has for you to do specifically? I can't answer that. But I do know what he has called all of us to. Each and every one of us has been called to share the gospel. Each and every one of us has been called to go to our particular Nineveh. And for some of you, it may be a relative. For some, it may be your job. For some, it could be your neighbor. I read a statistic that said 70% of Christians don't know their neighbors. But DaQuan, you don't know my family. You don't know my neighborhood. You don't know my job. I had a teacher in high school, and I've mentioned her several times, because she's probably left the biggest mark of all the teachers that I've ever had. But anytime I would say something as absurd as that to her, she would look at me like this. And she would say to me, Mr. Gibson, would you like to try that again? Mrs. Jensen didn't play. Jonah is called to Nineveh. It's the capital of Assyria. And it's the most violent and wicked place at this particular time. He had been, more than likely, he's old now, or at least seasoned, I should say. And that might explain why he seems to be so cranky. Nineveh is an ancient city, and according to Genesis chapter 10, it's a city that had been established by Nimrod. And by Jonah's time, it's now one of the largest cities and most powerful cities in the world. And the city is completely and totally corrupt. But this book, it's not ultimately about Nineveh. It's not ultimately about Jonah. It's not ultimately about Israel. It's about God's glory and His sovereign grace. There are lots of surprises in this book. I mean, from the opening verses, that there's evidence of God's love for people other than Israel. That is extremely surprising, especially in the Old Testament, especially to Jonah, that God could love another people, that God could save and want to save someone other than Israel. Let's look for a moment at God's absurd grace in the life and the events and the call of Jonah. And let's look, I think we'll look at the consequences of his reply to God. And I can't mark out the similarity enough than to say that Jonah is called by God just like we are, right? Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, Jesus says. So because I have all of this authority, here is what you are to do. Verse 19, go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Jonah's called. The word of the Lord came to Jonah telling him to go to Nineveh. We are called. Jonah rebelled, we rebel. Let's look at verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea, to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." So Jonah rebels, he goes the opposite direction, and now God is getting Jonah's attention through this tumultuous storm. The efforts of the sailors and the outrage of this captain who finds Jonah asleep. And then even these Gentiles were afraid, and they called out to his own God, each one of them. Here we have Jonah, the prophet of God. And God places him amongst Gentiles. Do you see this? Do you see the significance here? That this prophet of Israel, who doesn't want to do God's bidding to go to one particular nation, God places him in front of at least 3 nations. These Gentile believers, who all 3 have separate gods, which could indicate that they all come from 3 separate nations. They're calling out to their own God. And they're upset and they're afraid. So they cast lots to see who's responsible for this unusual storm. And the lot, directed by God, fell on Jonah. And I could see these sailors hovering over Jonah and hurling questions at him. And tell us, on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? What do you do for a living? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? And then we see this fear come upon these soldiers because they hear from Jonah's own lips that he serves the God who made the heavens and the earth and this sea that is tearing us apart. And I'm running from him. Now, how absurd is that? I serve the God who created the storm and I'm running from him. I serve the God who created the earth and I'm running from him. And the sailors, these men who don't believe, they say to him, "You have lost your mind. What have you done?" And Jonah doesn't respond. They knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he told them. And now Jonah realizes what he's done, and he realizes that these men on the ship are going to be punished because of him, with him. So he had to act quickly. When we disobey God, when we ignore God's call, and when we run from him, the consequences more than likely are going to involve innocent people. Do you get that? That it's not just you. You're not the only one that will suffer from disobeying or ignoring God. You have friends and family members and co-workers and, by all accounts, innocent people. But could you imagine being out in the middle of the sea on a ship and the waves are crashing up against the ship and you know you're going to die? Could you imagine how you would feel if you were Jonah, knowing that you would be responsible not just for your death but theirs as well? Would you choose to get off the boat? Or would you stay on board? and hope that God will still the storm. But see, now the soldiers are looking for a way out. And they ask Jonah for advice. And he says, throw me over. And at first they don't. They get rid of everything else except for Jonah. And it's not working. But they beg, get this. They beg the Lord to not lay this innocent blood on their hands. This I find very absurd, that these men who do not know God, the God of heaven, they know the law. They know that it's wrong to commit murder. These men who don't have a relationship with God, they know His law. They know that they are not to commit murder. Even the Gentiles know the law. See, Jonah, he realized that he would die and that he would take these men with him if he stayed on the boat. So he says to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me. And then the Bible tells us that these men kept rowing. In verse 13 it says, nevertheless the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more. If this doesn't make you scratch your head, I don't know what else will. They're not in a lake. They're not in a river. They're out at sea. And it's a storm. And they want to row to dry land? First off, any sailor will tell you, dry land is not where you want to be during the storm. Or the shallow water, I should say. The rocks are going to tear the boat up. And second, how in the world are you going to row out at sea, a great big ship? It's absurd. It just doesn't happen. You can't. So, they decided that they should pray to Jonah's God. And they all began to cry out in his name. Now this is absurd. It is his job to proclaim the glory of God, and he will not. He won't even acknowledge God before these Gentiles, other than to say, I'm running from him. How often do we, in our conversations, in order to be liked by friends and family members and strangers, how often do we forget to acknowledge the Lord? This is extremely absurd. These men who don't know the Lord are calling out to him. They're praying to him. So we pray, oh Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with his innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. They're acknowledging that it's wrong to commit murder. They're acknowledging that God is absolutely sovereign, and he does whatever he pleases. And these men are Gentiles. These men do not know God. And as Christians, we've been all called by Jesus And what is our response? Are we going out and doing as he has commanded us to do, or are we running? What is our excuse for not doing as he has commanded? Well, Lord, I'm shy. I'm quiet. I don't have a big voice. I don't know what to say. Well, DaQuan, it's easy for you. You're big and you're loud. I'm small and I'm quiet. Well, God declares to us in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, but you will receive power, might, dunamis, explosive power. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You are sitting here in this sanctuary because someone somewhere told you the truth about yourself, about your sin, your need for a Savior. Someone shared the gospel with you. That's how God operates. And he will operate with or without you. So God has called each and every one of us just as he has called Jonah. We all have a choice, just as Jonah did, to either obey or disobey. There's no middle ground. His will be done in spite of you or graciously including you. He has called you just as he has called Jonah. And he will take care of every single contingency. To disobey the call of God, it might bring regret, it might bring guilt, or it might bring some unpleasant consequences. And if you're saying, well, God, please, send someone else, think of what you might miss. Remember when he called Moses? And Moses was a bit reluctant. But Moses, he would have missed all of the miracles that we see. He would have missed the Exodus. He would have missed the law. He would have missed the tabernacle. Think of what you will miss by responding negatively to God. Think of the storm that you're facing if you respond negatively to God. I mean, when God is calling, he is only demanding and commanding and asking no more than what he should expect of every last one of us. So when God calls, as Jonah is about to find out, the best response is to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Wasn't that Isaiah's response? And Jesus makes it plain. He says, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. So what is your response? How will you respond? You and I. We have all been called by God to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. My daughter is venturing through the stage in life where she is concerned about what she will do with her life. And someone said to her, you can do anything that you want to do. You can be anything that you want to be. And I had to correct her. I said, no, you can't. You cannot be anything that you want to be. You cannot do anything that you want to do. You can be what God has ordained for you to be. You can do what God has called you to do. Why? Because your life isn't yours. It doesn't belong to you. You, baby, you have surrendered your life unto God. And I remember that day. I remember the tears. So the very breath that you breathe belongs to God. And you owe it back to Him. And He has called you. What is your response? And as we read through and journey through the book of Jonah, we'll see absolutely how absurd the grace of God truly is. That He has decided to love us. That He has decided to call us to do His bidding. That is absurd. Why? Why would God call me? Why would He even think to use me? What am I? I know one thing is for sure. I don't have what it takes to fight God. How does the saying go? My arms are too short to box with God. Jonah finds out for sure. He doesn't have what it takes to fend off God. Neither do we.